sapphire treatment. And in ruby and sapphire treatments, there are a number of challenges with rough that comes out of the ground. Because we saw with emeralds, it is mostly focused on the clarity. There aren't really any treatments that can help you improve the color of an emerald. Now, the color of an emerald can look better after clarity enhancement, but the actual emerald color hasn't changed because of it. For ruby and sapphire, that can be a whole other deal. Now, the first case we have to discuss is obviously an untreated stone. An untreated stone will have that listed under treatment where it says no indications of heating. Now, how do we detect that? That is mostly based on the fact that the inclusions, the impurities in the stone, for example, the crystals that we see there, or those needles, that they are completely unaltered. They are in a pristine state. You can see that those needles are beautifully long, elongated. Those crystals have a very nice outline, transparent appearance, completely pristine. They have not been altered by any process at high heat. Now, we can put these stones in a furnace, and heat treatment can happen in a number of different ways. So here are 3 heat treatment styles that are still occurring today, with the one on the top left being the most traditional one. This was already described more than 800 years ago, but people are still using the same technique, where they're using blowpipes and charcoal to improve the color of sapphires. Then we have the one on the top right, which started happening about 50, 60 years ago, where people are using fuels that could be diesel, kerosene, charcoal, to get a higher temperature and increase the burning temperature, getting a more drastic effect. Nowadays, most of the treatment happens in a furnace like this, which is an electric furnace with a heating element that has a lot of advantage. You can basically set the temperature, and as long as it's plugged in, it will hold that temperature. The one on the right, it is when your gas runs out, the burn is over. If you want it at 400 degrees or at 600 degrees, it is very difficult to control that. The furnace on the bottom, you can set it at 1648 degrees, and it will be 1648 degrees. So that is why a lot of people still prefer that furnace as well. But there are still people that are using the traditional burn, because that picture on the top right is a picture I took 6 months ago. So people are still doing it that way. Now, what is the reason? Why would you heat treat rubies or sapphires? And I've taken this stone because this stone has a heat treatment being done for it for 2 reasons. We can see that it is not the most attractive blue color. There is a slight hint of blue in it, but it is not beautiful blue. On top of that, it is very cloudy. It has very low transparency. So with corundum, there's 2 challenges that we need to face. We need to deal with that clarity, so improve the cloudiness or the fractures in it, and then we want to improve the color as well. And with heat treatment, we can do both. Because this is the other half of the stone, where we can see that the color has drastically improved and the cloudiness is completely gone. So we were able to turn that milky, cloudy, whitish stone into a very beautiful, transparent blue pebble. So that is the 2 main reasons why we do heat treatment on rubies and sapphire. Now, detecting that is often relies on the inclusions again, where we can see that the inclusions are completely different from what we saw in those untreated stones. Because these are very similar inclusions. The inclusions here on the left, we can see they are no longer transparent. They are completely turned frosty, and they are what we call now a snowball inclusion, because they look like these little fluffy white clouds, completely degraded by that high heat that they have been subjected to. The one on the right, if you squint your eyes a little bit, you can see that there's still those resemblance of a needles in there. We can still see those patterns like this and like this and like this in there. But those long needles that used to be beautiful strands of what we call silk are now completely broken up. They are what we call peppered. So they're completely broken up in these little pieces, completely degraded. Very classic sign of a ruby or a sapphire that has been heat treated at high temperatures. So when we detect something like that, we would put that on the report as under the treatment as heated. So it is still a natural stone. It can still be a ruby or a sapphire. We can still do the origin determination on it, but that stone would have a heated comment under the treatment section. instead of a no indications of heating. Now that is when we only see an improvement in the color. I mentioned already that there are sometimes issues with clarity as well, especially when it comes to the fractures there. So when we deal with the fractures, there are two main treatments that I want to discuss. And some of these treatments are known under different names. So I talked about the first one that I refer to as flux healing, but it is the same as heating with residues. It is the same as borax treatment. In Thailand, they call it pao mai. Then there is also the glass filling, the lead glass filling, or the pao kai, the new treatment. So those are two different treatments with the same goal in mind, and that is working on the fractures in your corundum, trying to mask the fractures there. So we're going to start with the first one, and that is heat with residue with flux. And it is actually a very complex process that happens there, but basically by adding flux, by putting flux into your fractures, you are able to heal your fractures completely. But of course, healing is never perfect. We have the same thing. When we cut ourselves, it won't stay bleeding forever. That cut will heal, but there will be a scar there. So it is these scars that we look for when we look for heated with residues. And actually, that residue part in that heat with residue explanation, that residue refers to the scars that we see in the ruby. And this is what is left. So this used to be a completely open fracture. This used to be filled with air. But now you can see that there is only these droplets of flux that remain, that is the scar, but most of it is actually filled with corundum now. So it has the same hardness, it has the same durability, it has the same chemical resistance as the rest of the corundum. That is completely healed, and we are only left with that scar where that fracture used to be. Now, of course, it matters how many of these scars we see, how many of these healed fractures we see. Because same thing as with emerald, if there's only one fracture that used to be healed, that material is much rarer than one with 100 fractures that have been healed. So we use the same classification there, that minor, moderate, significant. And you can see some visual examples here, where here there is some very subtle scarring here, but on the right we can see the scar is very big, very coarse. There's a lot of them out there. So that's the difference between that minor, moderate, and significant residue in your fractures of your heated ruby. So when we mention that, that is still a natural corundum, that is still a ruby. We could still do origin determination on it, but in the treatment comment it would say heated with minor residues, or heated with moderate residues, or heated with significant residues, depending on how many of these healed fractures we will see in the ruby. Most of the time, this is a process that is applied to rubies. Now then we have another process, a process that a lot of people frown upon, but I think it's very important to recognize, and that is lead glass filling. Now lead glass filling is very interesting, because it is not a complex scientific treatment. The easiest way I can explain it is, you have a ruby with a hole on it, you just stick the hole full of lead glass. Problem solved. That is what's happening during lead glass filling. So basically at this higher temperature, that glass will melt, it will go into the fracture, it would solidify there, and then it will completely hide the fracture. Now obviously that has some drawbacks as well, and this is very important to disclose, because a treatment like this, here we can see one of these lead glass filled fractures. That is glass that we put in the fracture. That is not corundum. And that glass has typical glassy features. It has gas bubbles in it, like we see in a lot of glasses. So that's how we can recognize it, where we see all these gas bubbles. On top of that, the refractive index, the optical properties of the glass and the corundum, they're not 100% the same. And how do we know they're not 100% the same? Because where they touch, where the corundum and the lead glass touch on the side of the fracture, we see these slightly colored flashes. So we see these blue lines running through it. Sometimes they're green, sometimes they're yellow. And these can be very obvious. Sometimes in a lead glass filled stone, even if you look at it like this, you sometimes see a very suspicious blue flash or a green flash in it. That is the lead glass filled fracture that you can see in there. But even with a loop, this is probably the easiest treatment to detect. So when that gets put on a report, that is still a natural corundum, that is still heated because this process only happens at high temperature, but it will say that it is clarity enhanced with lead glass. So this is actually the same process that we do in emerald, just with a material that is suitable for corundum, in this case lead glass. But it does come with this statement that this fracture filling material may be unstable at higher temperatures and to chemical agents, and special care should be taken when cleaning or repairing jewelry with these stones. Because for example, if you put a stone like this to the jeweler's torch, a corundum, a ruby or a sapphire does not care. But the glass inside those fractures will care. That will get altered, will even melt and leak out. So it is very important to notice, even as a jeweler. If you put this to aggressive jewelry cleaning products, which would have no effect on your corundum, on your ruby and sapphire, they can have a very big impact on the glass that is used to repair, to clarity enhance these stones. Now, how far can you push that? How much glass can you put into a ruby? And the answer is very, very far. Because you can see here that we have literally small pieces of ruby floating in a mass of glass. So that is material where there is more glass than ruby in there. And that is important to recognize that as well. Because this is a material, this is a stone like that was brought into a friend of mine's jewelry store, where he said, I got this from my grandma, this is my pigeon blood Burmese unheated ruby. And he said, boy, do I have bad news for you. Because he asked, okay, this is not what you think it is. Can I test this? Can I destructively test this? So he put this in the jeweler's pickle, standard used solution in any jeweler's workshop. And this is what came out after a couple of hours. So this is why it is so important to be able to recognize lead glass filled material. I'm not telling you to ignore it. I'm not telling you to stay away from it. I'm just telling you to be aware of it. Because it is probably the easiest recognizable treatment, but the mistake that you make for not recognizing it is enormous. Now, obviously, when a material like this comes through the GI laboratory, we will no longer call it a natural ruby. A piece like this that would just crumble if you take the glass out, that would get called a manufactured product. And it comes with that disclaimer that this is a product that consists of ruby and lead glass, where these two things are mixed together and later faceted. So that again, you can push it as far that these things actually become a manufactured product and are no longer considered a natural ruby with treatment. They become a manufactured product. Now, another thing that we can do with corundum is create extra color in it. We can heat it with extra elements in it, with extra elements added to it, and these extra elements will create extra color in our corundum. I'm going to go through this very fast because we know that in blue sapphire, for example, most of the color is created by iron and titanium. In ruby, it is because of chromium. But at iron and titanium, we can play around with it, and we can actually stuff other elements in there that will interact with it. So one of the most impactful treatments is what we call beryllium treatment, beryllium diffusion, which started happening about almost 25 years ago and really made big waves in the market. Because if you force beryllium into a corundum at high temperatures, it will turn material like this into material like this. So about 25 years ago, I wasn't in the industry yet, but all of a sudden, there was a lot of paparacha coming into the trade. So orange colors, yellow colors are very easily created by putting beryllium into your corundum. Again, nothing wrong with it as long as it is disclosed, because this treatment is stable, but a lot of the material has not been used, has not been disclosed. But I also want to tell you that most people that are aware of beryllium diffusion focus very heavily on the yellows and the paparachas, the oranges. But I'm here to tell you that in all of these stones, I have seen beryllium diffusion. We have seen beryllium diffused rubies, blue sapphires, pink sapphires, purple sapphires, green sapphires. it is a possibility in any kind of corundum. But most of it is going to be the yellows and the oranges where we have to be most cautious. Now another topic of controversy is how do we detect this? Because this is a procedure that happens at very high extreme temperatures, very high heat. So it is obviously going to have a big impact on the inclusions, but not every stone that is treated at extreme conditions is treated with beryllium. You can just put a stone at very high temperature without adding beryllium. So the only way of detecting beryllium diffusion in a ruby or a sapphire is to measure the actual beryllium. There is no indication in the inclusions, in the color zoning, in the FTIR spectra, in the UV-Vis spectra that you can use. The only way that you can detect beryllium in a corundum is by measuring the actual beryllium in the corundum. So at GIA we use an instrument that is called LAICPMS, laser ablation inductively coupled mass spectroscopy. That is not going to be on the test. But it is a very fancy, very high-tech piece of equipment where we basically analyze your ruby or your sapphire by burning a super tiny small hole on the kernel of your stone. The material we burn out gets pulled through this entire big machine, and we are able to detect chemical elements down to the size of 1 part per million. Now that is the equivalent of finding a stamp on a football field. That is the equivalent of going to New York City and I give you a list of 10 people and you've got to find those 10 people in New York City. That is 1 part per million. So that is the concentrations we are able to detect. And why do we need that good of equipment? It is because 1 part per million, 2 parts per million, 3 parts per million is enough to change your corundum from completely colorless to a bright orange. So it's that little material, that little treatment that can actually have a huge impact on it. Now I saw a lot of people getting very scared when I said we burn a little hole in the kernel of your stone when we do this testing. This is what that looks like. So this is the kernel of a round sapphire that is only a 4 millimeter round, and this is the size of the burn hole. So that is thinner than a human hair that we burn out. But that material is enough for us to detect if there is beryllium in it or not. Now when we detect that, we will list that as a beryllium diffused stone. So under the treatment section it will say beryllium diffused. Once a stone has been beryllium diffused, we often cannot issue an origin on it anymore because it has been so intensely treated, it has been so mangled through the inclusions that we can no longer issue an origin there. Now that brings us to the last part, and maybe the most interesting, most controversial part for a lot of things, because I recognize some faces who were at a talk earlier this week about describing color in gemstones and basically saying why that is a terrible and very difficult idea. Despite it being a terrible thing to do and a very bad idea and very challenging, GIA needs to make an effort because there is a lot of questions about it from the trade for these specific color calls. So I'm going to explain to you now how we approach this. How do we issue a pigeon's blood call on a ruby? How do we issue a royal blue call on a sapphire? So this has nothing to do with treatment. These are special color terms that the trade thinks are important. So the first thing I want to discuss is when we look at the color of gemstones, it is important to do that in a neutral lighting environment. I am wearing the worst suit ever to grade blue sapphires because everything right now is going to look 10% better. If you wear a red jacket while you're grading rubies, your grading is going to be useless because they're all going to look better. That is why a neutral background, a neutral environment is very important. That is why in laboratories, almost everyone uses one of these standard gray boxes where the backgrounds, the sides are all the same color. That is why your tray where you grade stones is a neutral white and it is not pink or blue or purple because it would just skew the color of it completely. The second thing is we want to look at it in consistent light. I think a lot of us are familiar with it. If we look at the same stone in the light here inside or outside, it's going to be completely different. If I look at the same stone in Hong Kong or in Paris, it is going to look different. If I look at the same stone in the morning outside or in the evening outside, it is going to look different. Now obviously that is a complexity that we cannot navigate. We cannot simulate that in the lab, so we choose, this is where we set our benchmark. This is the standard environment we use, and we know that that doesn't always translate exactly to where you see gemstones in the wild. This is not how we look at stones in the show, this is not how you sell gemstones. But it is a very convenient, practical alternative to look at color. Now when we look at pigeon's blood, there are a couple of things that we require. So in theory, it needs a pure red intense color, and it needs strong fluorescence under long wave UV. Another point is, it is not relevant what the origin is. Pigeon's blood has nothing to do with where a stone comes from. It is 2025, it is about time we get rid of gemstone racism. We're not doing that anymore. If a stone comes from Burma, if a stone comes from Thailand, if I walk outside here and I dig a hole in Victoria Park in Hong Kong and I find a ruby with this color, we will call it pigeon blood. The other thing is that treatment is not really an issue. A heated stone can be pigeon blood. A stone heated with residue can be pigeon blood. Now when a stone gets glass filled, it no longer qualifies for a pigeon blood. When a stone is diffused, it no longer qualifies for this terminology. But a heated stone, a stone heated with residues, is no problem. Also, the cut is irrelevant. Clarity and cut is not a thing. This is a color thing, not a cut or clarity thing. So how do we confirm this? We check this with master stones. So we have a set of stones where we can compare your stone that comes into the lab. So we put that in that standard box I showed you, and we can compare. If it is lighter than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. And if it is darker than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. If it is more purple than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. If it is more orange than this stone, it is no longer pigeon blood. And now I'm gonna do something crazy that I'm gonna trust all of you. And why do I trust all of you? Because you're all smart people. I'm gonna show you the master stones that GIA uses. And everyone's gonna promise me that they're not taking a picture of it, because you guys are all smart enough that you will be taking a picture of a picture of a picture on a terrible screen that will have zero value for you. So if you take a picture of it and I see you use it to compare a stone to, I will come and find you and you will get a good scolding. I'll keep it simple. So these are the master stones that GIA uses. So the first requirements we've got to check is, does it have a pure red intense color? And the lighting's not great here, but I think we can all agree those two stones on that side, they get a little bit of purple. They're still beautiful, but these stones are disqualified because they don't match that pure red intense color. Now then we also need that strong fluorescence. And we can see that those three stones on the left here have a beautiful red color, but their fluorescence is not strong enough. So these three stones are disqualified based on their fluorescence, which basically leaves us those four stones in the middle as being pigeon blood for GIA. Because those stones on the right, while their fluorescence is strong enough, the stones were a little bit too purple. The stones on the left, while their color is very beautiful in daylight, their fluorescence wasn't strong enough for a GIA pigeon's blood color. So when we put that on a report that is obviously a natural ruby, I think here you have proof that these stones can be heated with residue, and it will have that comment section where it will say the color appearance of this stone is described in the trade as pigeon's blood. So those are the requirements that we have. Now if we look at royal blue for sapphire, what we require for royal blue is that it needs a pure, rich blue color faced up, with an even distribution where we face it up. Because there's a lot of sapphire experts in the audience here, and I think you all know that color zoning in sapphire is a very common thing. If you flip a sapphire upside down, you very often see white bands running through it. Now the important thing is that when you look at it face up, because that is how we look at gemstones, it needs to be a consistent color. You can flip it around and it can have the biggest blue bands, colorless bands running through it. If it faces up an even blue, it is the right color. Again, this is not origin dependent. This is not exclusively for Sri Lankan stones, not exclusively for Madagascar stones. It has the right color, It doesn't matter where it's come from. Like I said, gemstone racism, we're not doing that anymore. The other thing is, again, the same as pigeon's blood. The treatment is not really relevant. It can be heated, it can be heated with residue. Again, when it becomes glass filled or it's a diffused stone, then they get excluded from it. So for rubies, a lot of them get excluded because of glass filling. For sapphires, a lot of them get excluded because of diffusion. Again, the cut, the clarity is irrelevant. As long as the color faces up in an even way, that is okay. Now, how do we check this? We confirm that with the masters. So here are our masters again. Again, no need to take a picture because you'll be taking a picture of a picture of a picture in terrible light. But we can see that the stones on the right, they are a little bit on the lighter side. Absolutely beautiful. And the stones on the left, they are a little bit on the darker side. So they are not that rich, beautiful blue that we want from a royal blue. So only those 3 stones in the middle would qualify as a GIA royal blue. So to wrap that up, on a report it would say again in the comments that the color appearance of this stone is described in the trade as royal blue. That's how you would recognize a GIA royal blue. So to wrap that up, for summary calls, origin is irrelevant. That's the first point I want to make there. Heat treatment status is also irrelevant, with the exception of diffusion and glass filling. And then probably the most important thing is master stones are critical for setting boundaries. And these master stones, you need those because you cannot compare corundum with a piece of paper. You cannot compare coloring corundum with a piece of glass. So you need to compare corundum with corundum. Apples with apples, pears with pears. Your master stone needs to be the same material as the stone that you're looking at. You can't compare it with a slice of paper, you can't compare it with a chip of paint, you can't compare it with a piece of cloth. Doesn't work. And then the last point that I just want to bring up is that chemical analysis is irrelevant. And I think in the talk that we heard earlier this week, where there was a lot of talk about describing color, the amount of chromium in a stone has nothing to do with the fact that it's pigeon blood or not. The amount of iron in a sapphire has nothing to do with the fact that it is royal blue or not. Nobody talks in these percentages because there is so much more to it. So chemical analysis is not part of your color determination. So with that, I want to wrap it up. If you guys have any questions, we can answer those at the GIA booth. That is, if you go out that way from the hall and you take a right,